Matt Hassan, thanks for joining us. Pretty extraordinary week thus far. Another one. Let's start off talking about this latest round of stimulus by the federal government. Firstly, it's about 105 billion between the federal government and the RBA. Firstly, your views on the government's stimulus package.
So the government stimulus package is designed to provide a boost to incomes and to households and to small businesses. It's a material undertaking, so we estimate that it's worth about 0.5% on GDP, depending on how it goes. On top of that, the RBA's moves this week essentially max out monetary stimulus. We're down at 0.25% for the cash rate. They've adopted a range of QE measures, including term funding for deposit ADIs, so the banks, and the liquidity measures designed to try and calm markets, which we're seeing globally. So the combined effect is material. These are bold measures. They're wholly appropriate given the situation. Unfortunately, there are limits to what policy can achieve in this situation. At the same time, we are seeing deteriorating conditions around COVID-19 abroad and to some extent locally. And we've seen an intensification of the social distancing and travel restrictions in Australia. So for us, those factors have outweighed the policy response to date, and we're facing into a somewhat deeper recession than we'd previously estimated. We see the economy contracting 1% in the first half of this year, recovering thereafter on the proviso that we bring the virus starts to get under control from around about June. Very hard to know how that's going to play out. A substantive hit that sees the labour market in particular weaken. We see the unemployment rate rising substantially to around 7% by about October. So yes, the policy responses are welcome and appropriate, but this is still a very big challenge we're facing into.
Is there a problem? Of course, there are the measures in there for small business, which is very important. The idea that they can just keep people in jobs, or at least businesses don't have to close. Is there a problem in the sense that people, even if they have extra money in their pocket, there's nowhere to spend it, or if they can't go out, they can't do things. Things have just ground to a halt.
That's right. So I think when we run our numbers looking at how we expect the consumer to respond to this, there are some clear segments, the most exposed segments of consumer spending, which are very highly exposed to social distancing rules and so forth. So air travel, for a start, is going to zero essentially. When we look at recreational services, which includes all the footy games that have been cancelled, and when we look at cafes and restaurants, dining out, those sorts of activities are really at the centre of some of the shock that we'll see domestically. There are spillovers, so you order Uber Eats rather than go to the cafe. Maybe you gamble online rather than going to the casino. And
supermarkets certainly doing well.
That's right. Supermarkets are doing well, exactly. So it's not all one-way traffic, but we think those segments are facing into about a 40% contraction, even allowing for those offsets in the second quarter. That is unprecedented. And it's very difficult for policy to work against that, and really policy shouldn't, because what the aim of the game here is to optimise the health outcomes for Australians. And so these social distancing rules are absolutely required to achieve that. And we shouldn't run counter to that with policy, trying to encourage people to go out and spend and do these things at a time when we're trying to manage the number one priority is around the health caseload. So, as I said, there are limits to what policy can achieve here. The focus rightly is on trying to cushion the blow to labour markets, to that employment piece. And there, it is a bit fluid. We're expecting another policy announcement over the next couple of days. We think that'll be targeting, trying to encourage businesses to retain staff through this crisis and try to cushion that blow to household incomes and so on. But at this stage, it's hard to see. It just doesn't look possible to avoid an outright contraction.
Now, the housing market is an interesting one at the moment, because actually in Sydney, Melbourne, it hadn't slowed. A bit of volume down, but people were still buying. Do you see that changing now in the midst of this? And furthermore, do you see reductions in the housing market price-wise when people basically start to lose their jobs?
Look, firstly, on volumes, I think absolutely now is the time when this starts to move. You're right, we haven't really seen much shift there. We have seen clearance rates sort of come down from the really high levels we had late last year and at the very start of this year, but they're still quite firm, and the number of auctions transacting is still reasonably high. It's interesting, in Melbourne, they had a public holiday the prior weekend, and clearance rates and volumes haven't really recovered since that public holiday. So there's early signs now that the market's already starting to see some coronavirus impact, and I would expect it to become much more apparent in the next few weeks. In terms of prices, I think it's a bit more of an open question. What we tend to see in property market cycles is when you get a shock, like not necessarily like this, but when you see a slowdown, buyers pull back, but sellers pull back as well. So you just see far fewer properties transact. So the price outcomes can often be slow to materialise. Even in cases like the bushfires or the Queensland floods, you sort of go looking for some shock impact on prices. It's just not there because the market just sort of pulls back, both buyers and sellers. So the test there will probably come a little later in the piece. If the economy's still struggling mid-year and buyers are not willing to stretch, and you've got a few more sellers who are in a must-sell position, then you might get more price effects starting to show through at that stage. But for now, we're still getting incremental price growth. March month-to-date prices in Sydney are up about 0.8. So it's slowed. It's definitely cooled off the pace that we had earlier. The other thing to bear in mind is, given the social distancing rules that we now have in place and just the general fears associated with it, we may see people go for private sales rather than auctions. Yeah. So the auction market itself might not be a particularly good guidance to what's happening in market activity. While we expect it to slow down and be weak, it could be.
On other aspects of the housing market, what I'm interested in, what about rents and the rental market? Do you see it declining in this environment?
It will be a little bit vulnerable in the sense that, so firstly, we do have fewer foreign students coming to Australia. Now, it's a bit up in the air at the moment as to exactly how that lands. So at the margin, we're likely to see slower demand for student accommodation. And I think rents are more likely to be sensitive to those income pressures. If we get job losses or reduced hours worked even could affect the ability to at the margin, to leave home and go into a rental accommodation. Yeah. So I think that might pick up on things, although the data around rents is not as clear cut, whereas auctions we get week to week and we have a very early read.
All right, Matt Hassan, well, there's plenty to talk about in the weeks to come, no doubt. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.